Well, hi there. So, in this lecture, we're going to take a little bit more in depth with terms of trade to try to figure out exactly what would be beneficial for both the buyer and the seller. So, let's get started. Okay, so the first part of this is actually just a little reference to a 1958 article by a man named Leonard Read. And Leonard Read was the founder of an organization that really contributed to a lot of economic thought. It's a conservative libertarian think tank called the Foundation for Economic Education. All of that's the backstory to say that I Pencil is a very famous essay in which Leonard Read describes how no one is an island, that we all have to trade to accomplish what we want, and that actually allowing people to harness their creative energies is really one of the best ways to make everybody better off. So I really encourage you to take a look at it, even if you don't necessarily agree with his politics, because it's from the perspective of a pencil. So it's kind of an interesting read. And I think it's cool because it illustrates all the different ways that trade affects our lives. The benefit of trade, aside from kind of just that specific example, is really that it allows us to consume beyond our production possibilities. If we tried to do things all of ourselves, we wouldn't be able to get as much. Even if you look at this comparative advantage table, burritos and pizzas, Mexico and Italy, if Mexico makes 30 burritos and Italy makes 10 pizzas, then that's more than if Mexico had tried to make that amount by itself, because Mexico can't make 10 pizzas and 30 at the same time. They can only do one or the other. And in this case, actually, you could have a situation where Italy's making 10 pizzas and Mexico's making 30 burritos, and they could exchange for however many pizzas and burritos that they individually wanted to actually hang on to. So they could both consume and they'd both be better off as a result of trade. Now, when we talk about mutually beneficial terms, what we're saying is that the deal helps both, right? That they both can get more than what they would get if they did it themselves. So acceptable terms would be ones that are helpful for both. Unacceptable would be one that's bad for one and good for the other. Just so you know, it can't be bad for both. Think about like a buyer has a maximum price, right? A buyer always will have a maximum price. Anything that you've ever bought, you have a maximum price. And a seller will always have a minimum. Ooh, that's my handwriting's getting even worse. So a seller will always have a minimum price, and they'll try to meet in the middle. Now, think about it from the seller's perspective. If it's anything above their minimum, they're fine. If it's anything below the buyer's maximum, they're fine. But like a buyer doesn't have, a minimum price, nor does a seller have a maximum price. So it's useful to kind of think about them as almost like bounds, a limit, if you will, a minimum limit and a maximum limit. So these terms of trade are expressed as one of the goods for a certain number of others, right? So it's going to be like, how many burritos would you trade for one pizza? How many pizzas for one burrito? You can also kind of reduce them. So if it's like 3 for 2, that would be the same as 1.5 for 1. Now, in terms of looking at our comparative advantage table, this is the same comparative advantage table we looked at prior. We're going to go ahead and resolve it again. This is an output problem. So we take the outside 10 over the 30, and that would be 1/3 of a pizza. 10 over 20 is 1/2 of a pizza. And then over here we have 30 over 10, that's 3 burritos. And then 20 over 10 is 2 burritos. So we're going to go ahead and circle 2 burritos because it's less than 3. And we also know then that Mexico must have comparative advantage because 1/3 is less than half. Mexico has it in burritos. From this, we know who's making what, right? We know that this Mexico is the seller of the burritos and Italy is the seller of the pizzas, and vice versa. Mexico is the buyer of the pizzas. Italy is the buyer of the burritos. When we start to calculate comparative advantage and going through all this stuff, I've tried to break it down into a stepwise process. First, we calculate the opportunity costs. Remember that when we're doing this, we're actually just setting the minimum and the maximum. So what we just wrote up here, buyer max, seller min, that's what these numbers refer to. So the buyer, which is Mexico, and they're buying the pizzas, the most they're going to pay is 3 burritos. The seller is only willing to accept at least 2 burritos. So they're going to have to meet somewhere in the middle if they're going to exchange for one pizza. So one pizza, for example, for 2.5 burritos would be good for both. And it's because we can say 2 burritos is less than 2.5 burritos, which is also less than 3 burritos. And what we want to do is kind of maybe make some reference to here Italy's 2 burritos and then Mexico's 3 burritos. And that's their 2 opportunity costs, which is the price of 1 pizza. And so this is our mathematical explanation for why 2.5 burritos would be actually a good deal. And if you're having trouble thinking about 1 pizza for 2.5 burritos, you can just think about it as 2 pizzas for 5 burritos. They would be willing to do that deal. And the reason they would, 2 pizzas for 5 burritos, would be because the ratio, 1 for 2.5, again, is in between their 2 opportunity costs. And you might be asking yourself, would this work if we did it the other side? Yes, it would. It's just that there aren't that many 1 burrito to like fraction in between 1/2 and 1/3, right? There's not very many fractions that would fit in between that. So that's why I chose this side. Now, unacceptable terms are either below the seller's minimum or above the buyer's maximum. So we'd say that 1 pizza for 1 burrito is bad for, and now we got to look up here and we got to remember that, well, this is the minimum. So that's the seller, right? That's the smaller number. So that's how I know it's the seller. And I also know that they have the comparative advantage. That's what makes them the seller. I also know that this is the buyer, right? Because they're obviously buying the pizza because they have the higher opportunity cost. 1 pizza for 1 burrito. Well, 1 burrito, that's below the seller's minimum price. So I know it's bad for the seller. Well, the buyer would be totally happy with it. Yeah, they would, because the buyer, remember, has a 3 as their maximum. But for the seller, this is below their minimum. So we'd say it's bad for the seller. In this case, that would be Italy. And the simple explanation for why would be because 1 burrito is less than Italy's 2 burrito opportunity cost, right? So we can even write here 2 burrito opportunity cost, just so we kind of get in the habit of remembering that what we're really saying here is that that's compared to their opportunity cost of doing it themselves. 1 pizza for 5 burritos, well, that's way more than the buyer's maximum. So I'd say that that's bad for Mexico, right? Mexico. And that's simply because 5 burritos exceeds, we would say, the 3 burritos of Mexico's opportunity cost, right? Op cost. So we would say that Mexico would not do that deal because the 5 is above their maximum price. The tricky part here is remembering that, well, yeah, 5 is obviously above 2 as well. And 1 here in this first problem is obviously less than 3, but it's remembering that we're thinking about, is it good for the buyer or the seller? One of them is always going to leave happy. There's a little poem down here from literally 400 years ago that I think is kind of interesting. And it's not directly tied to economics, but I think it's worth a little read. And the most famous part is obviously kind of the last part. What it really is saying is that we're all interconnected, that we all depend on each other in some way, even if we feel very, very isolated. And so I thought I would leave you with that. I'll see you next time.